In 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche picked up a novel he had never heard of, written by a Russian author he had never read, and within pages declared it one of the most extraordinary discoveries of his life. He called Dostoevsky the only psychologist who had ever taught him anything. He said reading him was a stroke of luck he ranked alongside his first encounter with Schopenhauer. Then he proceeded to spend the rest of his career building a philosophy that Dostoevsky would have recognized as the most dangerous idea in history. This is the confrontation at the center of the modern mind. Not a feud. Dostoevsky died in 1881, 6 years before Nietzsche found him, so only one of them ever got to respond. But a confrontation nonetheless, between two men who understood human suffering more precisely than almost anyone alive, who both stared into the darkest rooms of the human interior and arrived at conclusions so opposite that you cannot hold both of them at once. Nietzsche said, "Suffer well, transform it, use it. The pain that does not destroy you is the hammer that shapes you into something harder and finer than you were. The will to power is not the will to dominate others. It is the will to master yourself, to say yes to your own existence so completely that you would choose to live it again exactly as it was forever." Dostoevsky said, "Suffer honestly, submit to it. The pain you try to transcend is the pain you have not yet understood. The only way through is through, and the person who claims to have conquered suffering has usually just learned to call it something else." Both of them were right about things the other was wrong about. Both of them were wrong about things that cost their followers enormously. And the question this video is going to put to you, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a personal one, is this. When your own life cracks open, when the thing you built falls apart, when the suffering is real and present and not theoretical, which answer is actually available to you? Not which one sounds better, which one is true? The standard way to frame this comparison is as a debate between atheism and Christianity, or between individualism and community, or between the philosopher and the novelist. All of those framings have something in them. None of them is the real thing. The real disagreement is about what suffering is for. Nietzsche believed suffering was raw material, not good in itself, not something to be sought or celebrated, but something to be metabolized. The German word he kept returning to was Überwindung, overcoming, but with the sense of something physically surmounted, climbed over. You do not explain your pain into meaning. You will your way through it until the pain becomes part of the structure that holds you up. What does not kill me makes me stronger is not a motivational slogan. In Nietzsche's philosophy, it is a precise description of the mechanism by which great human beings are made. The pressure forges. The suffering, survived and metabolized, becomes the source of the very strength that lets you survive the next one. Dostoevsky believed suffering was revelatory, not raw material to be converted into strength, but a corridor into truth. The person who is comfortable, whose life runs smoothly, whose questions never press hard enough to become crises, that person does not know what they actually believe. They have never been tested. They have theories about themselves. Suffering strips the theories away and shows you what is actually there. Raskolnikov does not discover that he is a murderer when he kills the pawnbroker. He discovers it in the months afterward, when every system of self-justification he constructed collapses under the weight of what he actually did. The suffering is not the punishment, it is the teacher. These two positions are not as incompatible as they first appear, and the first part of this video is going to take them seriously on their own terms, but they lead to very different places. And one of them, taken to its logical conclusion, ends in a place that should terrify you. Nietzsche's life was not comfortable. This is easy to forget, because the image of him, the moustache, the hammer, the imperious proclamations, suggests a man who was never in doubt, never in pain, never visited by the ordinary miseries that undo most people. He was ill for most of his adult life, blinding headaches, failing eyesight, nausea that kept him confined to darkened rooms for days at a time. He resigned from his professorship at Basel at 34 because he was too ill to teach. He spent years moving between boarding houses in Switzerland and Italy, writing at the limits of what his body would allow, living on the edges of a reputation that would not be established until he was no longer capable of understanding it. His philosophy was built from inside that experience. The will to power is not the philosophy of a healthy man who has never suffered. It is the philosophy of a man who suffered constantly and spent his life trying to understand what the suffering was doing to him, what use could be made of it, whether there was a way to extract meaning from pain without resorting to what he considered the great lie of his century. That great lie was pity. Not in the ordinary sense. Nietzsche was not arguing that you should ignore people in distress. He was arguing that the philosophical framework which placed suffering at the center of moral value, which said that the person who suffers is automatically worthy of elevation and the person who thrives is automatically suspect, was a disguised form of resentment. The weak, unable to become strong, had inverted the values, called their weakness virtue, called the strength of others corruption, constructed a morality that sanctified the very thing they could not overcome. He called this slave morality, and he saw it everywhere. In Christianity, which he read as a systematic inversion of aristocratic values. Blessed are the meek, the kingdom belongs to those who suffer, the strong man's crime is his strength. In socialism, which he read as the same inversion in secular language, in what he called the herd instinct, the democratic impulse to bring everyone to the same level, which he believed brought everyone to the lowest level. What Nietzsche proposed instead was the Übermensch, not the Superman of bad translation, not the dominating, racially superior fantasy that his sister Elizabeth appropriated and sold to the Nazis after his breakdown. The Übermensch is the person who has fully affirmed their own existence, who has said yes to life so completely, including its suffering, its losses, its finite and meaningless arc, that they have arrived at what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, not acceptance, not resignation, love, the desire that nothing be different from what it was or is or will be. This is a genuinely extraordinary idea, and Nietzsche was genuinely a great thinker. The problem is what the idea does when it gets away from him. Dostoevsky was led to a mock execution at 28. The charges were political, involvement with a group of socialist intellectuals who had discussed, among other things, printing and distributing banned literature. The sentence was death. He was taken to Semyonov Square in St. Petersburg, dressed in execution clothes, made to stand with 2 other condemned men while the orders were read. A sack was put over his head. The firing squad raised their rifles. The reprieve came by mounted messenger at the last possible moment. It was deliberate theatre, organised by Tsar Nicholas I. One of the other condemned men had a seizure on the spot from which he never fully recovered. Dostoevsky spent the next 4 years in a Siberian prison camp. He came out a different man, and the difference is not what you might expect. He did not come out harder or more cynical or more committed to the revolutionary politics that had put him there. He came out convinced that the only honest response to human suffering was not to explain it, not to transcend it, not to convert it into strength, but to sit inside it long enough to hear what it was actually saying. The Notes from Underground, written after his return from Siberia, is the purest expression of this. The underground man is a figure who has been offered every rational framework for understanding his misery and found all of them inadequate. He is not stupid. He can argue the utilitarian position, the socialist position, the rationalist position better than the people who hold them. He demolishes them all because he knows from the inside what rationalism about suffering misses, that the person in pain does not experience their pain as a problem requiring a solution. They experience it as a truth, and the frameworks that try to solve it are, at some level, attempts to avoid that truth. What Dostoevsky's greatest characters share is not their suffering. They suffer differently, for different reasons. What they share is the refusal to lie about it. Raskolnikov tries to lie and is destroyed by the attempt. Ivan Karamazov constructs the most precise argument against God ever written, not as philosophical exercise, but as the honest account of what it feels like to live in a world where children are tortured and no cosmic ledger balances the books. Prince Mishkin, the idiot, is too honest about everything, including the suffering around him, and the world cannot survive his honesty. It breaks him. And this is what Dostoevsky understood that Nietzsche, for all his brilliance, could not accommodate, that the suffering which most needs to be sat with is exactly the suffering that cannot be metabolized into strength, the suffering that is just suffering, the loss that does not make you better, the grief that does not resolve, the question that has no answer. Nietzsche's philosophy requires you to be capable of the will to power. Dostoevsky's asks only that you are capable of honesty, and that is a very different demand. There is a passage in Ecce Homo, the autobiography Nietzsche wrote in 1888, just weeks before his final breakdown, that should stop you. He writes, "I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth, the most profound collision of conscience, a decision that was conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far." He was not wrong. He just did not live to see what the collision actually looked like. The people who inherited Nietzsche's ideas in the following century were not, for the most part, interested in the careful philosophical position he was actually articulating. They took the will to power and removed the self-mastery. They took the critique of slave morality and converted it into permission to treat the weak as objects. They took the Übermensch, explicitly a figure who transcends categories of good and evil in service of their own self-creation, and made him a justification for the domination of others. Nietzsche would have been appalled. His contempt for German nationalism, for anti-Semitism, for the brutality of power for its own sake is explicit throughout his work. His sister's annexation of his ideas for Nazi ideology is one of the great intellectual thefts of the 20th century. None of this is fair to him as a thinker, but there is a problem that cannot be laid entirely at Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche's feet. Nietzsche built a philosophy for the strongest, for the few who could actually achieve the amor fati, who could look at the suffering in their lives and metabolize it into genuine self-overcoming. He was aware that most people could not do this and did not particularly try to offer them an alternative. The herd was the herd. The strong would separate themselves from it. And what this means in practice, not in the philosophy seminar, but in the world, is that Nietzsche's framework has no resources for the person who cannot overcome, the person whose suffering is not a hammer forging them into something finer, but simply a hammer breaking them. The person whose pain does not produce strength because they don't have the strength to begin with, or because the pain is too great, or because what happened to them was genuinely, irrevocably wrong in a way that self-mastery cannot address. Dostoevsky had resources for that person. He understood that the person at the bottom and the person who cannot will their way through, who cannot metabolize the suffering, who is simply destroyed by it, was not a failure of will. They are the most precise test of what your framework actually offers. And the Brothers Karamazov is, among many things, the most serious attempt in literature to answer Ivan's question, what do you say to the person for whom the suffering does not resolve? Nietzsche's answer at its most honest is there is no answer. Become strong enough to live without one. Dostoevsky's answer at its most honest is love anyway. Not because the suffering is justified, not because it will resolve, but because the alternative, the cold philosophical distance of Ivan Karamazov, who understands everything and can love nothing, is its own kind of death. The 20th century ran both experiments simultaneously, which is one of the reasons it was the bloodiest century in recorded history. Nietzsche's ideas, distorted and weaponized, fed into the fascist movements that killed tens of millions. This is unjust to Nietzsche, but it is not coincidental. There is something in the framework, in the elevation of the strong and the contempt for the weak that is available for appropriation in ways that Dostoevsky's framework is not. You cannot do much with love anyway. You can do a great deal with the will to power. But Dostoevsky's ideas, particularly as filtered through the Russian Orthodox tradition he drew from, fed into a cultural and political passivity that had its own enormous costs. The acceptance of suffering as spiritually meaningful, the distrust of rational solutions to material problems, the celebration of the person who endures rather than the person who resists, these are not politically neutral positions. They kept people in conditions that did not need to be endured. They framed suffering as revelatory when sometimes it was just suffering. What the century demonstrated in its worst chapters was the danger of both answers taken to their extreme. Nietzsche without restraint becomes a permission structure for cruelty. Dostoevsky without agency becomes a permission structure for passivity. And the person standing in the wreckage of either experiment is left with the same question that each man in his own way spent his life trying to answer: what do I do with this? What does any of it mean? There is a detail that most accounts of this comparison leave out because it is too strange, too neatly significant to seem real. Nietzsche had a breakdown in January 1889 in Turin. He saw a horse being flogged in the Piazza Carlo Alberto. He ran to the horse, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed. He was found unconscious in the street. He never recovered. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of progressive mental collapse, incapable of writing, incapable of conversation, cared for by the mother and sister he had spent years philosophically outrunning. The man who built a philosophy around the will to power spent the last decade of his life without will, without power, without the ability to exercise any of the capacities he had placed at the center of his account of what makes life meaningful. Dostoevsky, who had been led to a mock execution and survived a Siberian prison camp and gambled away 2 fortunes and buried a wife and a brother, who wrote from inside illness and debt and grief for most of his adult life, died at 60 in his study, pen in hand, having finished the last chapter of the Brothers Karamazov the previous year. He got to finish the work. He got to say what he had to say. Which one understood suffering better? When Nietzsche read Dostoevsky in 1887, what he found was a psychologist, someone who had mapped the interior of human beings with a precision he recognized and admired. What he did not find, or could not keep, was Dostoevsky's conclusion. Dostoevsky's conclusion was not religious in the simple sense. It was not that God rewards the suffering, that the pain makes sense in a cosmic ledger, that everything resolves. Ivan Karamazov asked the hardest possible version of that question, and Dostoevsky did not defeat it. He built the rest of the novel around the possibility that love persists in the absence of an answer, that Alyosha, who has no argument against Ivan, simply keeps loving, that this is not weakness. That this is, in fact, the hardest thing. Nietzsche asked you to become someone who does not need the answer. Dostoevsky asked you to keep loving in the absence of it. Both demands are enormous. Only one of them is available to the person who is not and will never be the Übermensch. Only one of them meets you where you are. The question is not which of them had the better philosophy. The question is which of them you reach for at 3 a.m, when the thing you built has come apart and you cannot find a reason to get back up. Nietzsche will tell you to get back up and be stronger for the falling. Dostoevsky will sit with you in the dark. Both answers have their cost. Only you know which one you can actually use.